Well, let's turn to Genesis chapter 8. Having left off in Genesis chapter 7, when we finished in chapter 7 last week, we had begun, we finished in the middle of kind of a thought that had begun in chapter 6, as God laid out in chapter 6 the kind of a society that is very near judgment. And as he describes the society prior to the flood, he describes a society that is very much given over to sexual immorality, and it's given over to violence and wickedness, and the best of men and the best of men's minds given over to evil imaginations and the developing of these types of things, and producing movies and television and the albums and stuff to produce this stuff. And I'm not saying all of it is like that, but it is amazing as I read sometimes the budgets related to entertainment today, and some of it with the sole purpose of just being wicked. But that was the case, and the other characteristic of a society that was ready for judgment, and probably the reason that it found itself in the condition that it found itself in, was that the attitude of the people was that there will be no judgment. There is no God, and there is no right and wrong, and we're not going to be held accountable, and so business is going to go on as usual forever and ever, always. And so let's, eat, drink, and be merry. Let's marry and give in marriage, and let's not worry about eternal things and ultimate right and wrong and ultimate righteousness and ultimate wickedness and this kind of thing. And so they found themselves in just such a society, very much like the one we live in, by the way. And as best as I can look at things, and I don't think I need to stretch things terribly as a pastor in 1993, we look pretty close to the situation that's described in chapter 6. And then God goes on to speak in chapter 7 by way of review. He speaks of this man by the name of Noah. And in the midst of all of this wickedness, in the midst of all of this immorality, in the midst of all of this lukewarmness and this rejection of God and His standard, he says, but Noah. There was a man who was different from all of that. And there was this man that was different in that he followed God, and that he followed God with all of his heart. We saw a man who was given instructions as it related to building of an ark and preparation of this ark and the means of salvation that God would provide through that ark. And he was a man that God described continually through that chapter as a man who obeyed Him in all of His commandments. And the necessity in our life as Christians and the wickedness of the day in which we live is to obey God in all ways. We look at the great controversy today. If you have AIDS, I am not choosing this as an illustration to pick on you tonight, or to bring to your remembrance something that you come to church to perhaps forget about for some period of time. But we look at this, what is really a plague, not merely in our nation, but in the world, to such a degree that the experts related to this particular disease have written off entire continents. They look at, as long as a year and a half ago, they looked at Africa and they wrote it off. They've written off the continent in terms of turning that thing around. AIDS is going to get to run its full course on that continent. And it looks bad in India, it looks bad in Asia, it looks bad everywhere. But you look at this particular plague that's going forth, and here you have something that could be snuffed out in one generation if mankind would simply do what God's Word says. And that is, if men and women would marry one another, stay celibate until they are married, and then stay married to the person that they marry. And then stay away from drugs. Stay away from them. So you have two sins here that largely cast to the wind in terms of obedience to Him. And if there was adherence to just two of God's laws, you could in one generation take this thing and virtually move it out of the way. But man will not do that. I have no hope that He'll do that at all. But you see the importance of it for your life. Absolute obedience. We don't live in a day. We live in a day like Noah's day where there is no margin for error. There is no 3 strikes, you're out. It's 1 strike, you're out. 1 minute, you're out. Very dangerous days. And so the importance of obeying God with all of our heart and obeying every one of His commandments. There's no room for lukewarmness or partial obedience, which is disobedience. And so the importance of that, and that was what God found in Noah. And now we find ourselves in chapter 8. And the flood has come in, and Noah is in the ark with all of these living creatures, and they're floating along, and it says, "Then God remembered Noah." Now that can flip you out the first time you read it. What do you mean? What do you mean He remembered Noah? When did He forget Noah? Maybe that explains my life. It seems to me that He forgets me on a regular basis. This is my proof text. But the word really here, what he's talking about, is what's called a Hebraism, and it just means that God began to act on Noah's behalf. He had never lost sight. You remember that when He told Noah to get onto the ark, He said, "Come onto the ark." He'd never left Noah. And so now God remembers Noah and every living thing. And to me, there's a great tenderness in this verse. It's like God says, all right, I haven't forgotten you. And all of the animals that were with him on the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. Began the evaporation process. And the fountains of the deep and the fountains and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So the rain stopped, and the underwater springs ceased in terms of feeding this flood. And the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. And then the ark rested in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. And so here is where the ark settles. After 150 days from the beginning of the flood, it settles there on that mount, which is in modern-day Turkey. And there's interesting stuff in terms of attempts to find the ark, but there's no excavations of the mountains of Turkey these days. They cut that off several decades ago. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. And in the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. And so it came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. And he sent out a raven which kept going to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. And so the raven is a bird of prey. It can survive off of the flesh of other animals. And so there's no doubt floating this and that and things around that is, surfacing on these mountaintops. And so it had a means of nourishment. And so it would eat out there whatever it could find, come back to the ark, but not enter into the ark for food. And so he sent out from himself also a dove, to see if the waters had abated from the face of the ground. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot. She's a little pickier. And she returned into the ark to him, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. And so he put out his hand and took her and drew her into the ark to himself. And he waited yet another 7 days, and again he sent the dove out from the ark. And then the dove came back to him in the evening, and behold, a freshly plucked olive leaf was in her mouth, new growth. And Noah knew that the waters had abated from the earth. And so he waited yet another 7 days, and sent out the dove, which did not return again to him any more. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the 1st month, and the 1st day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. And so by this time, it has been over a year, in fact, well over a year, since those first sprinkles began to fall. That's a long time to be on a boat. And yet he waits before he gets off of the boat for the Lord's instructions. And it said, "Then God spoke to Noah, saying, Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you, and bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and cattle, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." And so Noah went out, and his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives with him, every beast, every creeping thing. Yes, we're familiar with these creeping things. Every bird and whatever creeps on the earth according to their families went out of the ark. And so we see here in chapter 8 a tremendous testimony to the faithfulness of God. He is absolutely faithful. He is faithful both in His judgment and He is faithful in His salvation. When He says that He is going to do something, He does it without exception. And all that really matters is not whether He's going to change His mind or